Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So we're back to our regular stations after 2 consecutive live shows. Those were a lot of fun. We'll let you know about any other live shows coming up and see where in the world we end up next. But to get to our data point for this week, that is only one data point, and it is 46,000. That is the approximate number of people who have died in the conflicts that started 1 year ago on October 7th.
The start of the Jewish high holidays comes at a tenuous moment, ahead of October 7th, which marks 1 year after Hamas attacked Israel, sparking the war in Gaza.
Iran, a year of profound national trauma for Palestinians. 41,000 officially killed in Gaza, but the true toll is likely far higher, with bodies trapped under the rubble. Gaza, already besieged by Israel before the war, now rendered unlivable.
We are now at the 1 year anniversary of the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel, and of course the attacks that came in return by Israel on Gaza, but now not only Gaza, that obviously very quickly spread to the West Bank and also immediately Lebanon. That's now escalated in Lebanon, of course, and threatens now to spread even further to Iran after a series of exchanges that have occurred in recent weeks, and most recently this week. We're awaiting the reprisal that Israel promises to exact on Iran after Iran fired ballistic missiles at Israel. So, a year of conflict in the Middle East. That 46,000 dead obviously mostly is concentrated in Gaza itself, where after a year of attacks by Israel on Gaza resulted in at least 41,000 dead there. Yeah, now looking back at this year of fighting, obviously this is an economics podcast, I said at the very top, so we're going to try to consider this horrific toll from that perspective. The economic effects have been highly concentrated in this year of fighting. I mean, Gaza has obviously been destroyed, and the West Bank is suffering massively economically. But the regional and global effects seem to be pretty limited. You know, if one were to take oil prices, for example, seems to typically be a harbinger of economic turmoil, but those prices haven't changed much as a result of all this fighting. So why exactly have the economic effects not spread more widely from this conflict, Adam?
Well, I think it's itself a symptom of the dismal history of the region for the last half century and more. The sad fact is that though, policy wonks often speak of something called the Middle East economy, and in many statistical categorizations, there's this thing called MENA, which is Middle East and North Africa. The idea of the regional economy is largely a myth. So decades of damage and isolation have meant that Gaza was an economic irrelevance long before disaster of October 7th and the subsequent Israeli response. The West Bank is more integral to its neighbours' economy, notably Israel, but it too is tiny. It had a GDP before the crisis broke out of as little as $18 billion, and that subsequently plunged. You were saying there's been serious damage to the West Bank economy. There really has. Estimates are pretty difficult to come by, but we're talking about a 20 to 25% fall probably in West Bank GDP. So that's a massive hit, comparable to the worst periods of the COVID lockdown, something like that, a really, really devastating shock, or an absolutely devastating depression. But both of these economies are tiny and not capable of destabilizing the big economies around them. Even if you add in the destruction in Syria, which is a almost 15-year catastrophe now, and the crisis in Lebanon, even if you allow for the fact that we're talking therefore in the surrounding Arab states of a population of about 30 million people, that's Lebanon, the Palestinian entities, and Syria added up, the devastation that they've experienced is just not registering on the economic Richter scale. I mean, and in part it's just to do with the disproportions, right? The Gulf states, The GCC, narrowly defined, has a GDP of $2.3 trillion. And if you add in Qatar, it's closer to $2.5 trillion. Iran is largely insulated from its neighbors behind, a variety of sanctions mechanisms. Iraq is a state in permacrisis, unhealthily dependent on its oil exports. And so we're really talking about a totally disarticulated, incoherent zone rather than a really deeply integrated regional economy in which the Gulf states continue to generate huge revenue from fossil fuel exports, which are largely directed towards Asian markets. But the region as a whole is completely incoherent. The worst zones of crisis are quarantined, and really big, too big to fail states like Egypt are basically propped up by external support from the IMF and very large injections of funds from the Gulf, whether it's from the Emirates or from Saudi Arabia. And so this reality that you talk about is a disarticulated and incoherent one. And that's why the utterly acute, horrifying disaster, the massacre that's going on in so many parts of the region simply don't translate into a wider economic crisis. And in some senses, therefore, also don't set off the alarm bells that would force a reaction because the degree of entanglement isn't there. And there's a sort of liberal premise that sits behind much thinking about the Middle East, which suggests that at some point this is so dysfunctional that somebody will have to do something about it. But from an economic point of view, that's simply not true. The Middle East economy instead has remained a kind of chimera, a kind of mirage on the horizon of various types of peace plans that often revolve around visions of infrastructure construction and tighter economic integration. But none of them ultimately ever provided an adequate answer to the Palestinian problem or to the problem of the regional struggle between Iran, its proxies, Israel, and the Gulf states. And that's what we see exploding in the current moment.
I mean, would it be fair to say that liberal premise used to be more reflected in reality, that like earlier Middle East conflicts would have had more spillover on the international economy? Is there something more recent here about this sort of shift, maybe more to the Gulf states as being more critical to the oil economy, or is there something new in this illusion of a regional economy in the first place?
I think what I think we are registering. I mean, we shouldn't glorify in retrospect the state of the Middle East economy in the 1960s or 1970s. Those societies were generally operating at a much lower level of GDP. But what certainly the point, I guess, the crucial point here is that globalization has not brought this region closer together, but in fact has sort of centrifugally spun the Gulf states off into a very different orbit and a very different level of economic activity. Israel also likewise, right, which is highly globalized and orientated towards the global tech economy and so on. And the Palestinian question remains a running sore, unresolved since 1967, all the way back to the foundation of Israel. And the novelty is that the big nation state, the developmentalist nation state projects that once were Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, have all in various ways run aground. And so those big pieces of the puzzle that once were powerful nation states with also big armies that were allies of the Soviet Union, all of those sort of relationships have broken down, and we're left with this sort of shatter zone now of largely failed states, which is why fundamentally, right, the Israeli claim that they face an existential security threat is just completely ahistorical and entirely unwarranted by the actual situation. Israel has, in relative terms, never been in a more dominant position than it currently is.
So let's turn to Israel then and its economic situation now. Obviously, it's been a year of war for Israel, a year of mobilization of the country at war. The country has also had to evacuate, or has watched as border communities have evacuated. I'm curious about, after this year, what sort of economic pressure is Israel under? Are there factors in terms of international economics that may be pushing Israel towards finding an end to this war?
This is where I would, go back to an analysis I've pushed since the beginning of the crisis, which is that, Israel's current political economy was built for this. I think it's not unfair to attribute to Netanyahu the strategy that, at the critical moment, when the moment came to really expand the conflict and to try and deal in a quite fundamental way with various regional threats and to take on Iran and try and break them, that Israel will be prepared for that moment, not in the position that it was in the 70s and 80s when it was cripplingly dependent on external aid. So Israel is in the position of being a very rich economy. Before the crisis, anyway, on certain measures, it had a higher GDP per capita than Germany, which is telling you how what a sophisticated place it's become. Very different from the relatively poor settler colonial project of the 50s and 60s. But it is making this strategic gamble on an escalating war. It's a very, very long way from anything even remotely like a total war mobilization because, and this is the fundamental point, it is choosing to fight this war. It is not like in 73 facing an existential threat. It is in a deliberate way escalating the destruction in Gaza and the effort to deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is expensive. According to the Israeli Central Bank, it's the current bill they think is going to come to 66 billion, which is slightly more than, it's about 11%, 12% of Israeli pre-war GDP. This is being spent over several years, so it's not all at once. Even with US aid, which comes to roughly $14 to $15 billion, so somewhere between 20 and 25% of that total, this is a strain. It's also true that tourism, God love us, tourism to Israel has declined by 75%, perhaps not surprisingly, which is bad for business. It's also true they've had to mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers as a matter of choice, right? This is a government choice to push this to a really large scale and wage a simultaneous campaign in Gaza and in Lebanon. This is obviously disruptive to Israel. Population of 10 million, if you take that number out of the workforce, prime age working young people, this is going to hurt. And then, of course, for security reasons, but also political reasons, they've imposed a ban on migrant workers from the West Bank. It's really difficult to get good data on this, but it's somewhere between 80 and 150,000 workers who've lost their permits. There's also a large informal sector. But there's no question that this is really bad for Israeli construction. If you need your house repairing right now, it's quite difficult to get a Palestinian worker to do it in Israel. So all of these things are happening. There's no doubt. It's also true that there is insecurity in global markets about Israel. It has for a long time been a very, very safe bet for financial investors, and obviously it's forfeiting that status to a degree. It's also not the attractive tech hub that it once was, so none of this helps. And it's not surprising, therefore, that estimates of GDP growth have fallen from a relatively rapid rebound from COVID of 3-4% to closer to zero, or maybe a half a percentage point in the near future. So Israel is growing slowly, and it faces a big surge in government expenditure. Several percentage points, maybe as many as 10 of GDP are being added. And so S&P and Moody's, the ratings agencies, have downgraded Israel by several notches this year. But, and you can feel the but coming, right? Israel starts with a GDP per capita on the same par as Germany, and it starts with a debt to GDP level, 60% of GDP, which by some measures is half the debt to GDP level in the United States. And it starts as a country which for the last decade has borrowed on more favorable terms than the United States Treasury at a lower yield. And so the net effect of this extraordinary escalation of military violence against its neighbors is that its credit rating falls to several points within the investment grade zone. So Israel is in no risk of becoming junk, and its borrowing costs are now fractionally above those of the United States. That's as much financial pressure as it's actually under. And as I said at the beginning, at the top, this isn't by accident. Netanyahu started life as somebody who was preoccupied with finance and understood this as the key element of Israel's political economy, that if at some point his right-wing vision of Israel's interests was going to assert itself, they would need to make Israel proof against external pressure, maintain the autonomy they need to pursue the strategy that they consider to be essential. And this is the payoff from that. It will take much more than this for financial pressure to be serious. That doesn't mean that they don't have problems within the coalition. They really do. The fragility is more on the domestic political front as to whether or not they can hold this coalition together. But I think it's not simply cynical or simplistic to say that part of the logic of continuous escalation is holding that coalition together. And Iran serves very, very well as the ultimate boogie figure, ultimate threat figure, because it is the only powerful state that really threatens Israel in whatever way it can. And that's the fundamental logic of the administration's policy at this moment. Apparently, also, this fact is recognized in the White House, according to leaks from people close to Biden. So I don't think it's terribly contentious that that's the basic logic here.
So, yeah, let's turn to Iran, the latest turn in the war has more directly involved Iran, and in some sense that became the case when Israel escalated its fighting in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Hezbollah obviously is a major factor in Lebanese politics, but it's also central to the Iranian government's strategic planning, sort of a major proxy that Iran has long supported and depended on for its own international national security strategy. Israel has ramped up its fighting against Hezbollah, and Iran has responded in the form of ballistic missiles, as I mentioned, that were aimed at various military sites in Israel. But that response doesn't seem to entirely match Israel's own escalation against Hezbollah in Lebanon, where thousands have died, or at least 1,000 already have died in Lebanon. And so Iran doesn't seem capable or willing to match that escalation. So what should we conclude about Iran's power, its economic standing? I mean, is it too weak in some economic or political sense to lead a regional bloc in the Middle East at all?
Yeah, the figure that screams out at me, just to amplify what you're saying about Lebanon there, Cam, is the 1 million displaced population, right? This is staggering. In a state as weak as Lebanon, and with the limited capacity to deal with those kind of refugee flows, it's really staggering. I mean, we've spoken about Iran a couple of times on the show, I think, but for some reason I hadn't clocked this basic fact that really brought me up short in doing the research for today, which is that Iran's GDP at just current exchange rates is 380 billion, only 380 billion for a population of 88 million people, compared to over 500 billion for Israel for a population of 10 million. And that's, an absolutely grotesque disproportion. Not that you'd expect per capita terms, perhaps Iran to have a higher GDP per capita than Israel, but you would expect the gap not to be that size. And that's a reflection of the developmental problems of the Iranian regime since the revolution and before. But above all, also, it's an immediate reflection of the sanctions which have hit Iran so hard in waves over time. And most recently with the collapse of the nuclear deal and the Trump administration, this really powerful wave of sanctions that were imposed. So with that kind of GDP per capita, that kind of GDP in total, of course, Iran has enough resources to bung a couple of billion to Hezbollah and to support Hamas, right? It can do that kind of low-tech, low-cost intervention. And it can use Hezbollah as a proxy in Syria, which we now know, I think, according to the research that the FT published, I thought was fascinating, that it was really Hezbollah's engagement in Syria that exposed them to Israeli intelligence penetration and then set up the disaster they've experienced now in Lebanon. So that's a kind of snowballing disaster from Iran's point of view. With that kind of money, Iran can fund low-tech cruise missile programs and can fund at least one expensive program in the form of the atomic development program, because that 380 billion gives you a platform. But if you look at overall military spending and you look at, say, the SIPRI database on this, that's the Stockholm Institute's database, by their estimate, Israeli military spending right now is about 4 times larger than that of Iran. I mean, that again, allow that fact to settle in. Israelis' defense spending is 4 times that of Iran and rising away from that of Iran, right? So there's not this sort of escalating wave of threat, but rather the contrary, an ever larger degree of dominance, which I think is much more helpful in trying to explain the aggression with which Israel is proceeding against the threats that it sees as surrounding itself and is only too willing to conjure up if they're not there and then strike against with absolutely massive and disproportionate force. The consequences for Iran of ramping up would be correspondingly much more severe than they are for Israel, because if you, as it were, waging war as a surplus kind of activity, and there's much smaller margin of surplus in the Iranian economy than there is in the extremely affluent Israeli economy at this moment. You could say Iran is sanctioned hardened, which is true. They're tough, they're smart, they've been learning for decades how to get around sanctions, but still another wave of pressure would be terrible for them. You see that notably, for instance, in the currency, which since the collapse of the nuclear deal has plunged in value. In 2015, when the deal was signed, the rial was 32,000 to the dollar. It's now 580,000 rials to the dollar. So that tells you how much depreciation there's been and how the purchasing power of average Iranians has collapsed in global terms. This is not a society that's in a place where it can easily absorb much pressure. Iranian politics, which are now not exactly pluralistic, but at least contested and open to competition, revolve crucially around economic issues. And so a war would be expensive. And how much leverage does Iran have in the oil market right now? Well, it's a major supplier to the oil market. It accounts for about 4% of global output. And the Biden administration has in no way been kind to Iran, but it has at least turned a blind eye to quite a lot of oil export by Iran, hoping thereby to relieve pressure on global markets, because the Iranians essentially serve as a unacknowledged but significant supplier to China, which helps the oil balance given the sanctions the West is trying to put on Russia. But from the Iranian point of view, that 4% gives them remarkably little leverage, because it's all really up to the Saudis, how far the Saudis would be willing in the event of a crisis to compensate for any losses of Iranian supply. And one thing that Tehran certainly can't count on is a friendly attitude from the Saudi side. How exactly the Saudis are playing this, I think, is an interesting question, and one that will remains to be seen. But in the event of a crisis, Iran could count on very little, I think, assistance from anyone else in the oil producing world. The Saudis are, if anything, moving on to a front foot in their pricing policy right now and trying to reclaim market share a bit, I think.
So obviously, the podcast would be incomplete without turning to Gaza in this conversation. A year of war, unprecedented destruction there. And yeah, the basic question that came to mind as I was considering this was simply, will Gaza ever recover from this? Is that conceivable?
When I was thinking about the question as you put it, as I agree that we do have to go there, is recover the right word, right? Is that even the right way to think about what's happened here? It's a little bit, I don't know, like asking somebody who hasn't been hit by a car, but has been run over by a truck, and then the truck's reversed over them, and then the truck has backed forward and then reversed over them again, and then backed forward, and you're left with a pulp. And then the question is, will somebody recover from this, right? And I don't even know quite. There are estimates, like the UN has done kind of ghoulish calculations of how long it would take to move the rubble around. They think it's 40 million tons of rubble, but 40 million tons of rubble spiked with thousands of unexploded pieces of Israeli ammunition, much of it supplied and paid for by the United States, and thousands of bodies, unrecovered bodies, right, that would need to be given a decent burial finally. And I don't really know even how one talks about that. With a clear, whether or not we want to use the genocide word, it's clear that Israel's intent is to, in its struggle against Hamas, to render Gaza unlivable, right? That at this point, I think it's clearly an undeniable war aim, is to permanently alter the circumstances of life and social organization and politics in that strip. And what does recovery mean against that backdrop? Because it can only happen through some kind of agreement. It can only happen as part of some regional deal, and there clearly just isn't even, there's no suggestion really of any plan of that kind. And so I think this is the horror, right, of the situation. And you wouldn't wish it on the poor Palestinian people to somehow go back and remake their lives. And on the other hand, if they leave, it's a de facto acceptance of annexation and a further displacement. It's a truly nightmarish impasse as far as I can see. And so, to be talking about recovery almost seems to be ignoring the scale of this disaster, which obviously results on the one hand from the choice of Hamas on October 7th to massively escalate, and then this huge unleashing of violence on the part of Israel that doesn't really seem to offer a future for this strip inhabited by millions of people.
Is it conceivable to return to the status quo prior to a year ago?
Well, but no, because Gaza was, for better or worse, a relatively it was an autonomous zone administered by a Hamas-dominated regime, which had its own logic, had its own political economy, had its supply lines that Hamas maintained. And there was a status quo, kind of this violent equilibrium, if you like, between Israel and Hamas that was accepted by both sides, that was hugely unequal and meant that Gaza sort of stagnated but didn't actually collapse as an economic zone. And there seems to be an agreement on the part of the Israelis and certainly Washington that Hamas cannot be allowed back. But there's no Gaza without Hamas in the last 20 years, right? 25 years. So what does that even mean? So the Israelis talk about some sort of locally administered zone and they fantasize about local tribal leaders doing the job for them. I mean, it's really neo-colonial stuff. And it's a tiny place with a small number of people. So to that extent, you may just feel you don't need a viable vision. But it's not tiny in relation to Israel, which is itself small. And, it's an outrage against, you name it, the number of international laws it's an outrage against. And it's to that extent surely non-viable. And to the idea that just politics will die and end and no resistance will emerge is surely, just profoundly unrealistic. Presumably the resistance now just is fully suicidal. What else could it be? So I think implicitly what's being said is this whole zone has to be basically evacuated and then rebuilt on Israeli terms, and those are the only possible terms. And so it becomes a sort of synthesized West Bank, which is, where you have like settlements and Israeli checkpoints everywhere, but you're going to make it from scratch rather than progressively intruding it into what it was previously a Palestinian space. So I honestly I don't think there's a vision here except for the exercise of massive violence and this pursuit, we must destroy Hamas, right? This is the mantra which gives this some quote unquote purpose.
Well, that's fittingly depressing after, again, this year of horrific violence. I suppose I would want to shift now, to a somewhat more parochial concern, namely how this fighting in the Middle East is affecting politics in the United States. Obviously, it is an election year. We are nearing the official election day. I'm curious how or whether the events in the Middle East have affected or could affect or will affect the election in November in the US.
I think one thing that's clear, because it's historical and it's amply supported by data, is that the position of the Biden administration and the president himself on the Gaza crisis was disastrous for his support amongst a variety of different constituencies in the US. I mean, part of the collapse of his opinion poll ratings has to do with Gaza, and it's a significant part. So Biden's support amongst Arab voters collapsed from a high of 59% during the election of 2020 to as little as 17% shortly before his exit. And approval ratings track similarly in a dramatically downward direction. It's also clear, I think, and this is much more anecdotal, that it was key to his lackluster support from other core constituencies, including minorities in the US, who feel marked solidarity with the Palestinians and amongst younger voters. And so that, I think, is not terribly controversial. There's a question as to the missed opportunities going forward, notably on part of Kamala Harris, because her line has essentially been a continuity line. She's hinted and suggested that she might take a more pro-Palestinian position, but she hasn't really stuck her head amongst the parapet and really made a strong stand on this. And there is opinion polling. I was reading some commissioned by the Arab American Institute from a reputable American polling organization, which shows that, or purports to show that this is a huge missed opportunity for Harris, and that amongst the American electorate at large, notably amongst independents and amongst Democrat-leaning voters, taking a stronger stand against Israel's indiscriminate violence in Gaza, and this was polling done before the Lebanon escalation, would be very popular and would potentially shift significant fractions of the vote decidedly and definitively into the Harris camp. In other words, it would be a game-changing signal that she's a real break with Biden. And many American voters want to see not Trump, but a break with Biden, and this would be a way of consolidating Harris's credentials. She seems, however, to be an entirely conventional pro-Israeli American. Insofar as she's got foreign policy, this seems to be one of her stances. And so there's very little chance of this moving. Now, you might say this was research commissioned by the Arab American Institute, and so they got what they wanted to hear. But if you look at other polling, like the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, that does general polling on Americans and the world and cannot be accused of a kind of, marginal or heterodox view on the American foreign policy, what you see there also is the same basic pattern, which is that qualified backing for Israel is not popular with the core constituencies of the Democratic Party or with many independents. And so the timidness, the weakness, just assuming there is a desire on the part of the Democratic leadership to move to a more concerted position versus Israel, is costing them. It's costing them votes amongst core constituencies, which raises a bunch of questions about why they would do that, the networks of influence, and conceptions of grand strategy and where people fit. Because from a geopolitical point of view, from a political point of view at home, it's really hard to see how this makes sense and why this is not self-destructive. If you believe the Arab American Institute data, a decided stance by Harris on this issue would shift her well clear of Trump nationally, let alone in Michigan, which is a key swing state. And what's really striking is it doesn't hurt her much amongst Republicans. In other words, they have their view of Harris in any case, but it doesn't seem to be like this standout issue that she will be destroyed in the public sphere if she took this position. So for what it's worth, it's a counterfactual, but given what we see historically about Biden's track record on this, you do have to ask yourself whether or not shyness and fear on this, or maybe just actual ideological or whatever other type of commitment to the Israeli cause is not. It may very well be costing the Democrats heavily at this point.
Well, then, I suppose we could end by making this even a bit more parochial, namely by focusing on what's going on at the Columbia campus itself, where you're a professor. There was a lot of interest in events at Columbia, at the protests at Columbia last year, and the response to those protests. They obviously became a kind of site where various opposing interests and ideas about the conflict in Israel became expressed. Yeah, what are things like at Columbia now? What does it look like? How is it for students, professors? What do you think?
Well, the basic answer is that the university administration clearly took the decision that there must not be another occupation, and there must not be, eye-catching, large-scale demonstrations, and they're throwing resources at it on a huge scale. I mean, Cam, you were telling me that you tried to get onto Columbia campus, and
I should say, yes, I could add here that we obviously just did a show in New York, and in the days before that, I was meant to join a seminar at the journalism school, and I encountered the sort of security protocols that are in effect right now, and they are remarkable to the extent that I managed not to be able to meet them or qualify to enter the campus for whatever reason. Like I had I guess been pre-approved, but didn't manage to get whatever subsequent QR code, and so I was stuck outside as the seminar was happening. I managed to find someone who was willing to help me out in some not entirely technically legal ways to get onto the campus. I won't say any more about that, but I did manage to get on and evade the security in a certain way. But it's remarkable, that a university is not, as far as I understand, not capable of hosting any guests at all, which is, in some basic way contrary to the spirit of a university, I think.
I mean, in fairness, we can host guests. I hosted Ed Miliband and Louisa Neubauer on campus last week, Britain's climate and energy security minister, and Louisa Neubauer, Fridays for Future, the European activist, the German activist. But it required highly elaborate preparation. You have to register the people in advance. They get a QR code. The QR code is scanned. Their ID is checked. It's oppressive. It's clearly meant to be. It's meant to send a signal. And what's even more remarkable is once you get on campus, literally on every corner of every squad, right, of every, because the camp was, people would have seen the pictures on this square of grass, this rectangle of grass, this garden square in the middle of campus, and like on on that particular lawn, I think there's maybe 6 or 7 security guards, 1 or 2 on each corner. And the students can still access the lawns, but only by, I think maybe they have to check their cards again to get onto the lawns. I don't know whether their bags are checked. I haven't sat on the lawns this fall. Like, it's extraordinarily comprehensive control. We're actually just discussing the possibility of opening up the building in which the history faculty is in, which has been on a card system since COVID, and they've sort of morphed the COVID controls into the October 7th controls, and we're now talking about rolling that back. In the organisation of the event that I was involved in, what we saw was an extraordinary sensitivity of the university administration to the presence on campus of 2 climate-related speakers, one of whom, as the figurehead of a major German organisation, has had to take positions on the issue which conformed to the standard German media line on the Gaza struggle, for fear of having her organisation tarred and feathered by the Bild-Zeitung and denounced as, anti-Semitic and Israel-hating. And what was extraordinary is that the university administration is actually concerned about that kind of visit to campus as well as a pro-Palestinian protester, because the general fear seems to be of just conflict, debate, argument at all, right? It's not specific positions, though, of course, there is a manifest bias in one direction, as was made clear last year in the clearing of the pro-Palestinian camp. But there's just an anxiety about any kind of debate, any kind of disagreement on campus at all. Actually, as it so happened, on that very day, there were very small, couple of hundred kids on each side, a pro-Israeli and a pro-Palestinian. There was, in fact, a Lebanese flag as well. Confrontation, which was stage managed. Confrontation is perhaps not the right word, but yeah, they were shouting their slogans and waving their flags at each other, and there were loud hailers. But they were no doubt all either Barnard or Columbia students. The whole thing had been pre-registered, and it went ahead. I happened to be entertaining another delegation of journalists from Germany, actually, on October the 7th, so next week, and it will be interesting to see. We've currently got QR codes for everyone. Everyone's in the system, but I have a backup plan for the event that they suddenly abruptly decide to shut campus that day, because one thing that's clearly happened is that the security side of the university has acquired a degree of autonomy from the other bits of the university and really functions according to its own logic, which in this context means nothing must happen, right? It's just nothing must happen. And so that's their job, and that's what they're going to do. And it's interesting, it's not regular Columbia security people, and it's not NYPD, though I gather NYPD and Columbia security are now tight, as they no doubt always have been. But a huge army of private security guards who don't seem very well equipped. I'm not sure they even all have walkie-talkies, but they're just present on every corner. It's this sort of the sign of the presence of order has to be everywhere, I think, at this moment for them to feel they can get through the term without a repetition of the fiasco of last year.
And it's interesting, not least because obviously all university campuses are back in session now. And in some sense, Columbia has, as if I understand correctly, has sort of made itself an outlier here in sort of taking this approach. And maybe, obviously, for good reason, I guess, or understandably if Columbia, in fact, is different. But I don't know if this entire security regime itself sort of produces the intense politicization that has been at issue here. So it is remarkable, and it is different. I guess we'll see how much longer it continues. So we'll stop here for now, but be back next week to talk about a couple new data points. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.